Before the Trojan War, before the battles of ancient Egypt, before recorded history as most people know it, there was a conflict so significant that it would become humanity's first documented war. This is the story of a battle fought 4,500 years ago between two Sumerian city-states, a conflict that would change civilization forever and establish patterns of warfare that continue to this day. What you're about to discover comes from one of humanity's oldest surviving documents, a victory monument that tells us not just about a battle, but about the birth of organized warfare, political propaganda, and the dawn of military strategy. To understand the world's first recorded war, we need to travel back to around 2525 BCE to a land the ancient peoples called the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia. This is modern-day Iraq, and 4,500 years ago, it was the most advanced civilization on Earth. Unlike the unified kingdoms that would come later, Sumer was a patchwork of independent city-states. Each had its own ruler, its own patron deity, and its own interests. The most relevant to our story are two neighboring cities, Lagash and Umma. Lagash was a powerhouse, with a population estimated at 30,000 to 50,000 people. It was one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Its wealth came from sophisticated irrigation systems that turned the desert into farmland, producing barley, wheat, and dates in abundance. But here's the thing about irrigation in ancient Mesopotamia. Water was power. Control the water, and you control life itself. And this is where our conflict begins. Between Lagash and Umma lay a stretch of extremely fertile land called the Gu-Edin, or the Edge of Paradise. Both cities claimed it. Both cities needed it. And for generations, this dispute simmered, occasionally boiling over into skirmishes and raids. Enter Eannatum. He became the Ensai, essentially the priest-king of Lagash around 2500 BCE. But Eannatum was different from his predecessors. He was ambitious, militarily gifted, and he had a vision of expanding Lagash's power far beyond its traditional borders. Eannatum didn't just inherit an army. He built one. He revolutionized Sumerian warfare by creating one of the first truly organized military forces in history. His soldiers trained together, fought together, and were equipped with standardized weapons and armor. The Sumerian military kit was simple but effective. Spears with copper tips, leather shields, sometimes reinforced with copper studs, helmets made of copper or leather, axes for close combat, and most importantly, discipline and formation fighting. On the other side, the ruler of Umma was no pushover. While we don't know his name from this period, the records are fragmentary. We know that Umma was equally determined to control the Gu-Edin. They had their own armies, their own resources, and their own sense of divine mandate. What made this conflict inevitable wasn't just resources or ambition. It was ideology. Both cities believed their patron gods had granted them ownership of the disputed land. This wasn't just politics. It was holy war. Before the first spear was thrown, there were negotiations. The Sumerians, despite what you might think about ancient peoples, tried diplomacy first. Messengers traveled between the cities, offers were made, compromises proposed, but it failed. Umma, perhaps feeling pressed by internal pressures, or perhaps believing they could win, rejected Lagash's terms. And Eannatum, who had been preparing for this moment, mobilized for war. What happened next was unprecedented in scale. Eannatum assembled what may have been the largest army the world had ever seen. Estimates suggest anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 men. To put that in perspective, this was more than 20% of Lagash's entire adult male population. This wasn't a raiding party. This wasn't a border skirmish. This was total war. The kind where the losing side might cease to exist entirely. And both sides knew it. On the night before the battle, both armies performed rituals. Priests blessed the weapons, soldiers prayed to their gods. Eannatum himself claimed to have received a dream from Ningirsu, Lagash's patron deity, promising victory. Dawn broke over the Gu-Edin. On one side stood the forces of Lagash, organized into tight formations. On the other, the army of Umma, equally determined. Between them, the disputed land that had brought them to this moment. Eannatum had adopted a formation that would later be famous in Greek warfare. The phalanx. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward. It was a moving wall of bronze and wood, nearly impossible to break if discipline held. The clash, when it came, was brutal. Ancient warfare wasn't the clean, distant affair of modern combat. This was face-to-face, spear against shield, where you could see the eyes of the man trying to kill you. Eannatum didn't command from the rear. Like leaders of his era, he fought at the front, and in the chaos of battle he was wounded, struck in the eye by an arrow or spear. But he didn't fall. According to later accounts, he continued fighting, blood streaming down his face, inspiring his men by his example. The discipline and training Eannatum had drilled into his troops paid off. The Lagash phalanx held while Umma's forces, fighting more individually, began to falter. Once a crack appeared in their line, it quickly became a rout. What followed was the bloodiest part of any ancient battle, the pursuit. When one side breaks and runs, they become vulnerable. The historical record suggests the slaughter was extensive. Eannatum's forces gave no quarter. When the sun set on the Gu-Edin that day, it shone on a landscape transformed. Bodies of the dead were left where they fell, thousands of them. The Stele of the Vultures, our primary source for this battle, gets its name from the scene depicted on it. Vultures carrying away the heads of the fallen. Everything we know about this battle comes from one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history, the Stele of the Vultures. This limestone monument, erected by Eannatum to commemorate his victory, is humanity's oldest detailed account of warfare. The Stele shows us exactly how these ancient armies fought. We can see the phalanx formation, the equipment they used, even the way they held their weapons. It's like a photograph from 4,500 years ago, frozen in stone. But the Stele isn't just a military record, it's also propaganda. Perhaps the world's oldest piece of political propaganda. Eannatum is shown larger than other figures, a sign of his importance. The gods themselves are depicted, blessing his campaign. The Stele was discovered in 1881 by French archaeologist Edouard de Sarzec, broken into fragments but still remarkably preserved. It's now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, where scholars continued to study it for insights into ancient warfare and society. When it was first erected in Lagash, the Stele would have been painted in bright colors, something we often forget about ancient monuments. It stood as a warning to enemies and a source of pride for the citizens of Lagash. This victory wasn't just recorded, it was advertised. Victory in the Battle of Gu-Edin didn't just give Eannatum control of the disputed territory. It established Lagash as the dominant power in Sumer. Umma was forced to pay tribute, their pride broken along with their military. But Eannatum wasn't finished. Emboldened by his victory, he launched campaigns against other Sumerian city-states, Ur, Uruk, Kish. All fell under Lagash's influence. For a brief moment, it seemed like Eannatum might unite all of Sumer under one rule. But here's the thing about empires built on military conquest. They're only as strong as their army. When Eannatum died, his conquest began to unravel. Umma rebelled. Other cities reasserted their independence. The cycle of warfare that had begun with the Battle of Gu-Edin would continue for centuries. But the battle's true legacy wasn't territorial. It was tactical and cultural. The innovations Eannatum introduced, organized formations, standardized equipment, strategic planning, these became the foundation of all future warfare in the region. Today, the site of ancient Lagash is a desolate mound of ruins in southern Iraq. The great city that once dominated Sumer has returned to dust. But its story, preserved in stone and clay, continues to teach us about the origins of civilization, both its glories and its horrors. So what does the world's first recorded war teach us? First, it shows that organized warfare isn't some recent development. 4,500 years ago, humans had already figured out formation fighting, military logistics, strategic planning, and combined arms tactics. Second, it demonstrates that the fundamental drivers of conflict haven't changed. resources, ideology, pride, fear. These motivated Eannatum and his enemies, just as they motivate nations today. Human nature, it seems, is remarkably consistent across the millennia. Third, the Stele of the Vultures shows us that propaganda is as old as war itself. Eannatum knew that winning the battle wasn't enough. He had to control the narrative. He had to make his victory seem divinely ordained, inevitable, glorious. Sound familiar? But perhaps most importantly, this ancient war reminds us of civilization's paradox. The same society that created writing, mathematics, irrigation, law codes, and architecture also created organized warfare, progress and destruction, creation and violence. They've always existed side by side. The Battle of Gu-Edin wasn't the first time humans fought each other. Far from it. But it was the first time we wrote it down, the first time we documented the tactics, the strategy, the brutality, and the aftermath. In doing so, Eannatum didn't just record a battle. He created a blueprint for warfare that would be copied and refined for thousands of years. Today, as we look back across 4,500 years at that dusty battlefield in southern Mesopotamia, we see both how far we've come and how little we've changed. We've built weapons that would terrify Eannatum, conquered distances he couldn't imagine, and reached heights of civilization the Sumerians never dreamed of. But we're still fighting over resources, still invoking divine authority for our actions, and still writing our victories in stone, or in this case, in pixels and data. The world's first recorded war isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror, reflecting both our capacity for organization and innovation, and our tragic inability to escape the cycle of conflict. The story of Eannatum and Umma is in many ways still our story.